Hello and welcome to Podcast Essentials. Today we're talking about sound effects, adding layers of sound, perhaps even soundscaping is the correct phrase for it. And I'm joined as usual with my co-host from sunny Blaney, where I believe there's a bit of snow overnight, Mr. B.
This morning, John, and yes, thank you very much for having me on. Just a little tad of snow. They're after rain here in the bush in the central west of New South Wales, but it's looked quite nice actually. I think that's the first, maybe the second snowfall we've had this year.
You'll actually get some moisture into the soil anyway. Must be the day for it because we had 5 drops of rain this morning, so it's all go.
I keep hearing about your drought. Yeah, it's odd to me talking about snow from Australia and you talking about drought from Ireland. So
it's a strange time to be alive. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so there's a blog post that accompanies this piece that I put out a few hours ago.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to mrjohnmoore.com and hit on the blog tab in the menu bar at the top, it goes into a more written, detailed version of what we're going to be talking about. And so basically, you can get very heavy-handed and carried away with sound effects if you're not careful. The excitement of it is just overwhelming. Oh, I can put this in here, I can put that there. And YouTube provides a tab for producers that has a whole pages and pages of free sound effects. And they basically cover everything. So it's very easy to put explosions or whatever in the background if you really wanted to. The point I made in the blog post was if you go and do a test, take your little recorder, whatever you're using, if it's only your phone, and sit in a coffee shop as close to the espresso machine as you can and hit record. And maybe read a 3-minute script into it so that you've got something consistent to work with. When you've done that, go home, record the 3-minute script in your usual recording space where you've got all the sound dampened, and then think about what you would add to the second clean version to give the impression you're in a coffee shop without having the volume of the coffee shop, which tells you the difference between adding sound effects and dealing with real life sound in the background. We just need to give hints about what's going on, I think, rather than the full-on clunk, clunk, clunk of whatever it is we're trying to do. Maybe dial it down to about 10%, just a hint there in the background. Not quite subliminal, but at that sort of just above that level. You got thoughts on that, Rich?
Yeah, I mean, the thing too is if you go and do what you say first and just record the say you're doing an interview and you record it next to the espresso coffee machine, you're just going to ruin your interview. But if you wanted coffee sounds, a possibility would be to just record them, do the interview somewhere else, and then on the track on Audacity or whatever software you're using, just add it just underneath, and you can adjust the volume. There was an example where my co-host put in an advert and underneath put in music. The music just cut straight through the ad. It was it just didn't work. So I think you're right, John. I think it's a subliminal thing, and you get to have control over the volume if you add it later.
The trick, though, is not to deceive our listeners. If we're in a coffee shop, we're in a coffee shop. I mean, if you're trying to give the impression of, say you're saying in your podcast, imagine that this took place here, and this was where I met such and such, and then you can sort of fade into it and have the subtle sounds, maybe a teaspoon hitting a saucer or stirring or something. Yes. But the volume levels have to be real low. And music, of course, is always dangerous because you can get carried away with the power of it. And it's, if you listen to a music track while you're in a cinema watching a film, you can see the subtlety of it. And they did experiments where they used the same film but used different music. And in one scene, people screamed, and in the same scene, people were laughing, depending on which music they used.
Yes.
And music, you got to be real careful because of copyright. If you've only ever got your friends and family listening to your podcast, well, no one's going to bother you. But if it blows up and you're getting 100,000 downloads an hour, the people that own the music will come looking for you. And then you've got to either go back and re-edit it out of all your episodes, which can be a lot of work, or you've got to cough up some cash. And maybe if you're getting 100,000 downloads an hour, you're making a few bobs so you can afford to. But it's probably best to avoid the unpleasantness to start with, I find. Now, there are other places where you can get sound effects. There's a place called the Sound Bible, and it's got some really good stuff with some Creative Commons sound effects there. Now, depending on the Creative Commons license, you might have to give acknowledgement at the end of each episode about where you got the sound effects from, and some others are just use as you please. I remember for the first 15 or 20 episodes of World Organic News, I was using a Morse code signal from the Texas Sound Library. It's still embedded in my mind. And so I used to add that at the outro of every episode with thanks to such and such from the Texas Sound Library. But I find Sound Bible's a good one. I suspect if you just Google free sound effects or Creative Commons sound effects, you'll find a whole lot more. But again, it's very time-consuming to faff about putting sound in. And it really would, you've got to think carefully about why you would do it. Most podcasts like this one, where we're having an interview and a chat, it's not even an interview, just a chat. I don't think there's any need for sound effects. Future me might put some in the podcast just for effect, just to show how pointless they are. But as this is live, there's no need for it. You know, I don't see the need for them most of the time. If you're doing, say, what's the word? You're reading your novel or your short stories in, then maybe some sound effects to give some mood would be useful. You know, doors opening, that sort of thing. If you wanted to go the full radio play sort of direction. But with most audiobooks, I don't think you need to do it either. It's just something that people suddenly get a hold of. Now, I remember there was a podcast I was listening to. This bloke discovered reverb as a special effect on his voice. And whenever he was reading a quote, he reverbed it. That lasted 2 shows because the flood of complaints swamped him.
Can imagine that, yes.
Yeah. I can see why he was doing it. You know, here, look, I'm quoting, it's someone else's work, and I'm acknowledging it by giving it a different sound. But I find if I put quote and end quote around someone else's words, people understand that it's not mine. Have you had any need to use sound effects, Rich?
We were lucky enough at Climactic, John, to have a professional composer who donated a theme. Now, I didn't have anything to do with this, so I can't take any credit for it. But it's actually a fantastic theme. I listen to it, you know, just for fun. It's great. And what my co-host did was, it's a climate change podcast, so we integrated some speeches and news items on climate change with the theme running underneath. Now, as the editor, what I use the end part of that theme, and I'll use that to introduce different segments, just a brief little thing. And that's easy enough to do on Audacity. I think I did mention to you a while ago, John, that I did have this idea, one of my crazy ideas, and this is where John will do a face palm, I think. But it was to do a documentary. It was to do a documentary, professional documentary, and what I'd chosen was bushrangers, and I really wanted to do something that was professional, but really it's something that you need a team to work with, and professional studios, and of course time. And for the normal podcaster listening and watching this, they don't have that.
Yeah, it's the time is the real killer. I think with the tech gear and stuff we can use now, you can probably get away without the professional studio, but it's the time. And when you're doing it with this sort of gear and whichever editing system you're using, it's going to take time to add layers. Years ago, I might even put it back up again. I did a short 5-minute maybe mini documentary or audio essay probably on making bread at home.
Yes, so I remember that.
Yeah. Yeah, so I recorded the voice, the monologue I was after, and then I went and made some bread. And every time there was a sound involved, I just hit record on the Zoom. And so I had all these little snippets of, bread being kneaded or bread being stirred, dough being stirred in a steel bowl. The one I was most happy with is when you pull the loaf out of the oven and to test it, you hit the bottom and you can hear the echo. And that sound was just...
Yes, that knocking the bottom. Yeah. Yeah. I remember that episode, John. It was almost like you could smell the sourdough in, through the headphones or something like that. It was well done. It was very well done.
Yeah, thank you for that. It was, and that was, of course, beginner's luck. The first time I ever did anything as a form of recording and creation. So maybe if I did it now, I'd probably overthink it. But I just put it all together, and the recording space I was using then was just horrific, and none of the settings were right on the Zoom. But we managed to get away with one. So yeah.
Would you say? Just going to say, John, would you say in this situation that less sound effects is more, say, like taking the bread baking audio essay, not to do too much, or would you perhaps put more in than what you would do normally?
Okay, well, compared to my normal podcast, it had more in it because my normal podcast don't have any. But with that one, I probably overdid the tapping on the base of the bread, but I was trying to make a point that the sound represented the real bread, and then I was reading the ingredients in shop bought bread, and sort of the tapping underneath. The idea was to show the difference between the two. Because if you buy shop bought bread and tap the bottom of it, all you get splodge.
Yes.
So maybe I overdid it a little bit, and I'd probably do a little bit less now, but definitely less, I think, is more, a whole lot more. And it's about hinting at emotion, hinting at feeling, hinting at space. I'm working on it at the moment. There's a couple of spaces I've been into, different churches and one particular retail place where half the roof was off and it was designed that way. And the feel in them was just unbelievable.
Yeah.
But getting that feeling into a sound or a soundscape is still something I'm sort of working on in the back of my mind. But I think subtlety is the key. It's, unless you're going for comedy and you want pratfall noises and all the rest of it. And that's a whole other, like, if you think back, those of us of a certain age and certain upbringing remember the sound effects from the Goon Show.
I do very well, yes. They were meant to be hilarious, weren't they? They were great, yeah.
And a little bit heavy-handed, but that was the point. It was supposed to punch you. And people had fun with it. Again, with the music, be careful. Even if the way around copyright, of course, is to, like you were saying before, you've got sound donated. The other way is to write your own and create your own. Now, I have the musicality of a rock, so I'm not going to go anywhere near that. But I'm sure there are people out there listening who are quite capable musicians or have siblings who are.
Yes.
And, there's ways and means around it if you must have music. I find, when you're trying to get hold of people the first time they listen to one of your podcast shows or episodes, is you've got to grab them in the first 7 seconds. And if the first 20 minutes, or first 2 minutes of your show is music, it just puts people off. And I'm starting to get the irrits with one of the ABC shows, Late Night Live, which is a radio show, admittedly, and not a podcast, but it comes out as a podcast. And sometimes it'll be 2 minutes worth of intro music, which can be nice, but I'm listening for the content, not the same music that gets played every night.
Yes,
and they play the same music at the end, which can go on for 2.5 minutes, which is, you had an hour. Why are you wasting 5 minutes of my time with the intro and outro?
And I guess too, John, that you don't need anything flash. One of the major CBC Canada shows Ideas. I haven't listened to it for a while, but it just has that one note that disappears and quietens, and it's just very good. It just just goes that one note, bang, and then just winds down, and then the guy comes in. That's all. And this is a major CBC current affairs program. It's very effective indeed.
It can be. The trouble with the CBC is that they're now putting 15 to 30-second advertisements at the start of their podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
And really, I don't need to buy a mattress from North America, no matter where I'm living, outside of North America.
You never know, John. You might need one.
Yeah. I don't think free shipping extended to either Australia or Ireland, but and they do get very repetitive.
Mm-hmm.
But before they started doing that, and I'd noticed the BBC is going to start adding advertisements for podcasts outside the UK. And
it's unprecedented.
Yeah, and it sounds like the way the ABC is starting to add, this is an ABC podcast at the start of their shows, that they might be going to squeeze in some advertising space the way SBS does, but we'll see. The point to remember, though, I think, is that you've got to know why you're adding the sound. When I go back to the bread example, I wanted to show the sounds of handmade bread, which is why I added those sound effects. If there's no reason to add stuff to your podcast, it's probably going to diminish the listener's value.
Mm-hmm.
It's just going to become annoying, a bit like the reverb on the quote that we were talking about earlier. And I try to remember what the listener experience is every time I'm creating a podcast, because that's why we do it. Well, that's why I do it anyway. If you're not keeping your listener in mind, then they'll stop listening. It's not rocket science. But, I don't think there's much more we need to say about this, except be careful, be subtle, and make sure you're not breaching anyone's copyright. You got any thoughts on it, Rich?
Look, the only thing that I've made a note of here, John, is that I think some listeners, viewers may be interested if they're new to podcasting, perhaps just a little bit more on Creative Commons, what it is, and how they can use it.
Okay. Well, Creative Commons is there's several licenses under copyright. Copyright normally says the creator owns it, and anyone who wants to use it has to acknowledge them in academic use or teaching use. And if they're going to use it for anything else, they've got to have an agreement in writing to do so that usually involves a consideration, which means cash normally. Creative Commons allows people to create things that are then shared creatively and in the commons, as in everyone can have access to it. And I said there's a couple of different variations on that. There's the free-for-all commercial Creative Commons, where you just, here it is, use it. And there's the Creative Commons with acknowledgement. Now, this applies not just to music and sound effects, but blog posts, pretty much any sort of creative content can have a Creative Commons license with it.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Sound Bible, you need to really check every track that you're looking at to see which particular license it is, because I couldn't find a way to sort them all with free for all or acknowledgement or whatever. So, and it's a way to keep yourself safe legally, and it's also morally the right thing to do, because you're not stealing other people's work.
Yeah.
And then when it gets to copyright, then there's different copyright laws around the world, so you've got to have different licenses from every space, because podcasting's a global event, he said, hopefully. And we'll get on to copyright in a later episode, because there's all kinds of rabbit holes you can go down.
Creative Commons, sort of in essence, John, isn't it? I think you'd agree, is an opportunity for podcasters starting out. They've haven't got a big budget. They can't afford to pay for expensive music. If they just spend a little bit of time researching Creative Commons, they can pick stuff up. But as you say, John, they've got to be careful if it's a commercial thing or exactly what sort of license they've got. But it's definitely an opportunity, and you can get sound bites, you can get theme music, and you can get just about anything on Creative Commons now, I think, as you pointed out, John.
Yep. You can even get YouTube videos that are Creative Commons license that you rip the audio out of if you want to have a quote from the person you're quoting in their own words.
Yep.
And just because it's Creative Commons doesn't mean the quality's any lower. Quite often it's better, or on par or better than a lot of the commercial for sale stuff, I find.
Yeah.
Now, those sound effects will be important to remember for our next episode, our next session, which will be on the gentle art of storytelling. Now, I believe storytelling, it's what makes us human. And so we'll be covering that in a little bit of detail. That'll be next Tuesday morning at 9:30 my time, 6:30 in the evening Australian time, where Rich is, or 4:30, I believe, in Western Australia, for both of you there. There's, like I said, there's a blog post accompanying this episode on mrjohnmoore.com if you hit the blog tab at the top there, and we've just redesigned a little bit of the menu bar there so you can see the courses we offer as well, and you can sign up for the free checklist to get you started with the pre-launch session part of podcasting. And I think with that, Mr. B, we might call this one to an end unless you've got anything else pressing.
Just to say thank you very much, John. That was very interesting. I'm really looking forward to Tuesday and storytelling. That'd be fantastic.
Yeah,
thanks again, mate.
I'm looking forward to it myself. I've got to work out what I'm going to say yet.
But I'll put you on the line.
no doubt I'll come up with a story. All right, everyone. We'll pull this one to an end.
All right, mate. Bye. See ya.